Hello. If you've been watching my videos recently, you'll know I've been looking at the Jacobs Creek brand through its various quality levels and varieties and blends. So today I wanted to look at one of the best-selling white wines, the Chardonnay, the Classic Chardonnay. This is the 2025 vintage of that. And this is a wine that vies with the Shiraz Cabernet to be the best-selling brand in the range. Now, Jacobs Creek, of course, has been a very important brand for the Australian wine industry. Built on delivering good value, the brand's been developed since its release 50 years ago in 1976. And initially those developments were as what is now the Classic range. And today they produce somewhere over 6 million, probably approaching 7 million cases of wine a year, all produced at their winery in Riverland Flat at the southeastern end of the Barossa Valley. And these wines are exported to somewhere in the region of 70 countries worldwide. Now, the current Jacobs Creek portfolio spans somewhere in the region of 30 wines. These are generally defined by variety, but some by style and blend. And although it's difficult to clearly define, there are nearly 10 ranges that relate to commercial tiers, and these include limited release speciality collections. So the wines start with the Classic range of everyday, good value varietal wines or blends. They have a reserve range above that, which has a regional identity. They also make a range of wines labelled double barrel, where they've done some experimentation with finishing wines in casks that have previously held spirits. They make sparkling wines. They make their unvined range, which is a range of de-alcoholized wines. They make a range called Le Petit, which evidently are wines with a particular Australian twist. And then there are a number of heritage and limited release wines, which obviously are small batch wines and tend to be sold at a premium. Now, just briefly, the origins of Jacobs Creek date back to the early days of winemaking in the Barossa Valley. The label of the wine bears the date 1847, and that commemorates the Gramps family coming and settling in Riverland Flat, planting vineyards alongside the banks of Jacobs Creek. The brand's lineage, however, also includes William Jacob, the English surveyor after whom Jacobs Creek was actually named. He and his siblings having purchased land here and planted a vineyard in the 1850s. The two companies were joined actually in 1916 when G. Gramps and Sons purchased what had been William Jacobs' winery and vineyards. Now, Gramps, who made and sold wine under their Orlando brand, were seen as being particularly innovative during the 1950s and the 1960s. For instance, in 1956, they launched a brand called Barossa Pearl. They'd been the first people to import equipment to enable them to make Charmat method sparkling wines. And Barossa Pearl was a semi-sweet, lightly sparkling, fruity wine, which for a period through until the 1970s was popular on the Australian market. During the 1960s, Gramps were also pioneers of using stainless steel tanks to enable them to cool fermentations for white wines, creating wines that were much fresher and retained their fruitiness. As I say, it was in 1976 that Orlando released a wine called Jacobs Creek Claret. It was a blend of Shiraz and Cabernet with a little bit of Malbec just to soften it. Now, within 4 years, that brand was Australia's best-selling red wine, and by 1993 it was exporting 2 million cases of wine a year. The company had been purchased in 1989 by the French wine and spirits company Pernod Ricard. It was Pernod Ricard's first investment in Australasia. Just to round out the brand's history to the present, in 2025 the wine arm of Pernod Ricard was merged with Accolade Wines to create a global wine company called Vinarchy. And Vinarchy have major brands in Australia, in New Zealand, in Spain, and also in South Africa. So it will be interesting to see how the merger affects future development of the Jacobs Creek brand. Now, as far as this wine is concerned, it's quite difficult to find out what the wine's fruit sources are. It's actually simply labelled as Australian. They don't even label this as a wine from southeastern Australia. But what little information I can find is that it's broadly sourced from vineyards across southeastern Australia. And if we look back at the fruit sourcing for the Shiraz Cabernet, we see that that was sourced predominantly from the Riverlands, and that was supplemented by quality wine coming from Langhorne Creek and additional sources of higher volume fruit from the Murray-Darling region. Now, although I believe there's some Chardonnay grown in Langhorne Creek, I don't think that's likely to be a significant contribution to this wine. However, some other notes I've seen suggest this is a combination of wines from warmer vineyards, so the Riverlands, the Murray-Darling region, and cooler climate vineyards. Now, cooler climate sources, if you're looking at South Australia particularly, is going to narrow you down to the Adelaide Hills. I noticed that the Jacobs Creek limited release Chardonnay is sourced from the Piccadilly Valley. So certainly Jacobs Creek do source fruit from this area. They could also be getting Chardonnay fruit from the Eden Valley and some of the cooler, higher altitude vineyards from the Barossa Valley. So just quickly to talk about the Riverland region, here we're talking about 200 kilometres northeast of Adelaide, centred around towns like Renmark, Berry, Loxton and Barmera. These are areas of flat vineyards, they're highly mechanised, lying in a sun-drenched region alongside the Murray River, so there's good availability of water for irrigation. And these vineyards produce high yields of ripe fruit that is often described as primarily being used as bulk base for affordable brands, so such as the Classic range. Again, the Murray-Darling Basin continues across the South Australian border into Victoria and New South Wales. And here there is a vast, warm inland plain that, much like the Riverlands, consistently produces large-scale, cost-effective volumes of grapes. At Jacobs Creek do say they're looking for a broad flavour spectrum across the parcels of wine that they blend to put into this. So they're looking to combine crisp, citrusy notes that you'll get from cooler climate fruit with richer, riper, broader flavours of melon and peach from riper portions of fruit likely to be grown in these warmer inland areas. Jacobs Creek are also happy to say that they source fruit from a network of somewhere in the region of 120 independent growers. A lot of these are smaller, family-owned grape growing operations. But certainly Jacobs Creek's marketing outlines the fact that they like to treat these as if they're wine growers. They're very much emphasising the idea that the wine's quality and style is defined in the vineyard. To that end, they have a team of viticulturists who will work really closely with the growers throughout the season. So they're not simply turning up just before harvest, working out when the grapes are ripe and deciding when to pick. They'll start just after the previous harvest by looking at pruning. They'll look at crop levels, they'll monitor bunch size, they'll look at the canopy management to make sure there's not too much shade, to make sure there's sufficient leaf area to ripen the fruit. So they're looking to interact with the growers to manage all areas of vine health and grape quality. Another thing that Jacobs Creek stress about their Classic range is that they're committed to sustainable practices in their winemaking. Certainly I'm aware of the fact they've been trialling regenerative agriculture. Now that was a trial of 3.5 hectares, so certainly this isn't something as yet that's going on right across the growers' vineyards or even right across their own vineyards. But certainly they've been working hard to make sure all their vineyards have inter-row plantings to help improve the quality of the soils. They've also been looking at other ways of increasing biodiversity in their vineyards. They've reintroduced native plantings within some of their vineyards, and they've specifically restored an area of wetland that surrounds Jacobs Creek. And there are other areas such as sustainable packaging that you would certainly expect a large company such as Jacobs Creek to be adopting such practices. Now the 2025 vintage throughout Australia was something of a mixed bag. South Australia and Victoria saw quite a mild winter and a hotter than average spring. However, there were significant problems with frost, particularly in the Riverland region. And some vineyards lost between 80 and 50% of their crop as a result of that. And it should be noted that as one of the earlier ripening varieties in that region was one of the worst hit. The vintage then went on to be Australia's second hottest vintage on record. And yet at the same time, in some regions, it was also the wettest in more than 10 years. However, that rain varied between regions, with much of Victoria and South Australia seeing below average precipitation. Particularly these warm inland regions, persistent heat and below average rainfall combined to compress the harvest window and make it one of the fastest and hottest harvests in living memory. So let's have a look at this wine. We're talking about a wine that's 100% Chardonnay, predominantly, if not completely, machine picked, with this picking going on late at night. In fact, often really early in the morning, from 1 or 2 o'clock onwards is when the vineyards are coolest. So ideally they'll be waiting for temperatures to drop to 15 degrees just to ensure the best retention of acidity and fruit aromas. Once the fruit was pressed, the juice was allowed to settle, and then fermentation took place in temperature controlled stainless steel tanks. Evidently particular yeasts were selected and used to try and emphasize certain components of the fruit, particularly the stone fruit and melon aromas. Now the wine's label describes this as having subtle oak. I don't believe any of this wine has been barrel fermented or barrel aged. However, what is most likely is the addition of oak staves to the fermenting tanks to give some well integrated toasty notes and subtle vanilla hints without necessarily overwhelming the fruit in this medium bodied wine. To add additional complexity and richness, some parcels of the wine will give an extended lees aging, with the lees being stirred up to try and impart some sugars and some proteins to fill out the wine's mid-palate. Malolactic conversion would also have been conducted on at least a portion of the wine, just to reduce the crispness of the acidity, but also to give some more rounded, buttery, perhaps creamy flavours and textures. Residual sugar is noted as being below 4 grams per litre, so this is a completely dry wine. The wine is sealed, as all the range are, with a Stelvin screw cap to prevent cork taint and to ensure crispness, they say. And also noted on the label is the fact that this may contain traces of both eggs and milk, presumably from fining that has gone on there. So I just note that for vegetarians and vegans who may choose to avoid the brand as a result. So let's take a look at it, shall we? The wine has a lovely, vibrant, medium yellow colour there. I might almost say it's got a sort of a slight greenish hint to it. Swirling it, it's labelled as 13% alcohol, and it's quite readily forming tears on the side of the glass there. They're quite slow to form, but they're very noticeable. So that's not necessarily just the alcohol, that will also be the richness imparted by that lees aging. So let's have a look at the aromas and see what we make of those, shall we? Medium intensity of what starts off as lemony fruit, moves on to a delicate stone fruit. There are also some slightly mineral notes and some creamy hints sitting behind it. All those aromas are quite harmoniously married, and there's a nice focus to them. So let's have a taste. The palate is dry, the wine's medium bodied. There's quite a noticeable toastiness coming through on the mid palate, and that's followed by both creamy and peachy hints. The acidity is fresh without being particularly tart. There's a slight note of greenish fruit towards the end, sitting alongside some crisp lemony acidity that's giving the wine a reasonable length. As I say, the wine is medium bodied, perhaps it's sort of more light to medium bodied, and while there is some peachy fruit, this isn't a huge, rich style of Chardonnay. There are just those hints of toasty oak and vanilla, but actually they're quite well integrated. The alcohol at just 13% isn't standing out and making the wine hot or heavy. Personally, I find the wine quite attractive. I guess actually on balance, it's slightly towards the greener edge of the Chardonnay spectrum. It doesn't have that full, rich, rounded, mouth-filling peachiness that you'd get with a big, rich Chardonnay, and yet at the same time, there are hints of that. Now, looking at the Wine Search aggregated critic score, that comes in at 86 out of 100, but that's across all vintages. There isn't actually a score for the 2025. Personally, I think the wine is slightly better than that. I think I'd be looking at giving this 87 out of 100. It's not a wine I'd be putting away in the cellar to age. At the same time, it's fresh, it's cleanly made. I still have a clean, fresh, citric and mineral note on my palate. And I think if you're looking for a Chardonnay with reasonable crispness to serve as an aperitif, it would function really quite well in that situation. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you found this tasting of interest. If you have, it would be great if you could press the like button for me. If you're watching my tastings and you enjoy them and you think you're likely to be watching more of them, it would be superb if you could sign up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It would really help me to develop the channel further, to have a larger follower base. And if you do that, do make sure that you set yourself an alert, and that way you'll be notified every time I publish a new tasting. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, and that way you can see what the wine's price is and what its availability is in your market. And I think you might be pleasantly surprised at the value for money that the Jacobs Creek range offers. Now, if you have any comments about the tasting or experience of Jacobs Creek's wines that you'd like to share, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, and anything else that relates to that. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time. Come and join me for another tasting in the near future. Till then, bye for now.